Welcome back to the Evolve and Play podcast. Today, my guest is Flynn Disney,
Hi
which
guys.
sounds like a Disney Prince character, but is actually his real name.
Yeah, we
Um,
have Flynn Rider is a Disney character, which makes my name ungoogleable.
that's you're gonna have to work on that.
Yeah, change my
But
name.
uh, but Flynn's been a guest on the podcast quite a long time ago.
Mhm.
Flynn was originally recommended to me by Callum Powell from Store, and I think you're kind of you know you remind me a lot of myself in that place where you've really gone deep into a physical practice and then you're starting to see that physical practice through this broader lens of personal transformation. And so it felt like you were kind of at the beginning of that journey the last time we spoke, which was about 2 years ago. And it feels like you've really matured as a thinker and a teacher in the last little bit. And you're putting out, I think, some of the best content around parkour out there, around movement practice out there. But it seems like people aren't really hip to it yet. But the level of sophistication of the research that you're doing around different topics and the kind of like depth of psychological research and insight combined with movement practice that you're doing, it's just been really awesome to see. So let's
Thank you.
remind people a little bit about you and your background. Tell people how you got into these arts um, and how it sort of gestated into the movement and psychology, which is your
Yeah,
Substack.
I've been doing parkour for 17 or 18 years since I was 13, 14 years old, and I can't say that I was a fast learner, or that I saw myself as someone who was necessarily destined for greatness.
Mm-hmm.
I felt sort of happy to be there.
Yeah,
Is pretty accurate, but yeah, I mean, my learning history has been largely motivated by my inadequacies or my absences. What's not been present in my own abilities or subjective experiences, things that I've not felt access to, have been a big motivating factor in terms of my physical research and this let's call it theoretical research. Or that word never quite sounds right to me. Um, so yeah, what to say? I'm an autodidact. I mean, that's a big part of what I'm doing, really. I tried to go to university when I was about 18 years old, but I had no idea why I was there.
yeah.
So I was lost, totally lost. And I left after a year. Um, and then my interest in education actually came through dog training.
Okay.
Is Was the original avenue for personal
Mm-hmm.
for autodidacting was through dog training. So I learned to work with dogs in this sort of like traditional behaviorist style. It's about reinforcement schedules and this kind of stuff, and there's a lot of really good stuff there. But I kind of ran into a lot of situations where it was clear that this was not enough to work with the dog that I'd been given, and that there was clearly more going on than just sort of reinforcement and reward and punishment and this sort of stuff. It's like what I'm talking about is working with people, right? And not just with dogs. It's like when you start working with another human being, it's hard not to see the complexity there.
Right.
And so I was
So
like,
basically,
okay. So, so
systems.
there's, go
Tell
on.
me about the
Sorry.
dog. I just need to know about this dog. What kind of dog was it, and what made it complex? Why wasn't so? Was there anything specific about the dog that made it, not simply responsive to behaviorist
Hmm.
approaches?
Well, I mean, we can go personal straight up. I had a dog and I had to give it away. When Yeah, it's a personal story, but when I was in a relationship, we got a dog together. I think I was maybe 24. We got a dog together. The relationship didn't work, and I poured my heart and soul. This is after some years of the education already, but I poured my heart and soul into trying to give him being the dog, the this kind of re-education of behaving in a way that was calm and socially acceptable, because he had a lot of aggression. And so I poured a lot of energy into this, and despite what could have been perceived as a successful or a technically good, conditioning sort of protocol or series of protocols that I was working with, the emotional stability was not there.
Yeah.
And everything hinges around that fundamentally. So I would say that would be the most sort of honest answer to that I can give, is like, what was the biggest kind of teaching experience within that chapter of my life, was certainly working with my own dog, who had a lot of aggression issues that I was fundamentally not able to in the end help him with, because I think I didn't have the stability in myself at the time. And hopefully now, if I had a similar situation, as I do, I have a little miniature Pinscher, who's a very different creature, little orange dog, Pinscher by name, Pinscher by nature, they say. So he's got his stuff, and we work quite well together. And
Pinscher meaning biter, right, in German, more or less.
Makes sense.
Actually, it's funny to me, because I had a deep love of dogs from when I was young. I used to walk dogs at the local community, or at the local humane society, throughout my teens, and then I also had a couple of dogs with human aggression issues, and it's a hard situation. Then I learned a lot from I learned a lot about human beings from reading about dog training. Right, one of the things, one of the stories I was telling, talk about rough and tumble work, the roughhousing work that we do, is from a book called, I think, The Serious Book for Puppy Training, which talked about jaw sparring in dogs, and how if you inhibit a puppy's biting behavior too early, you'll actually make the dog more dangerous, because it's a fundamental aspect of canine development. So you have to let them bite you gently as part of their play, and then you remove yourself when they get too intense, and then they learn to regulate. That's how they develop.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you just punish them for biting, you create a dog that's more fearful, a dog that's less capable of basically doing fundamental dog things, and a dog that has far less inhibitory control of its bite.
And within that, I think, is one of the core insights into human behavior. It's like, what you suppress, you often energize in yourself. But, if you had these experiences when you were younger of aggression, for example, I think you've spoken about this, and then this becomes this thing that you're not allowed to express, and you can't then express it in a healthy, holistic way. And I had an experience teaching a workshop recently that reminded me of what you were talking about. I introduced someone, a male, to rough and tumble play, that he had not engaged in this kind of behavior since he was younger, when he was actually fighting people. When I think he was, it sounded like there was a real violence there. And so it was very challenging. It was a very intense experience for him to go through this, and of course in a very gentle way. And he ended up asking to work directly with me, because he had more trust with me. We had more of a repertoire. And so in this sense, it's I think it extends very far beyond just conflict. But I think conflict is a huge one, isn't it? The willingness to engage in conflict. And I remember very fondly from our previous conversation, one of the things that I took away from our previous conversation was, there were a couple of times where I would express something, and you would say very clearly, "I disagree." I said, I really like that. That's really clear. So
the ability to manage conflict healthily is such a fundamental and difficult thing for human beings. And rough and tumble play, I think, is actually the foundational piece that we as a society have inhibited deeply in children and dogs, and then as adults, we're all kind of walking around with this capacity for violence that we have zero capacity to articulate,
Sure.
to recognize where it meets play and how it.
Yeah, I always like this analogy of getting on the roller coaster without wearing a seatbelt.
Yeah.
It's like if you don't know where it's going to go, then you're much less likely to get into these kinds of conflicts. I think if you never engage in these more elevated emotional states, then you're much less likely to engage in any kind of conflict. If you don't know what your kind of upper limit is, how do I respond when I'm in an elevated emotional state, a state of arousal?
This guy who had all this violent background, I'm curious what his national background was.
He was British.
British. Okay.
Yeah.
Because interestingly, over many, many years, I haven't run into that so much, teaching roughhousing. Like someone who I've run into a number of men who are kind of poorly regulated because they just haven't played, and then they've started martial arts, and then they get kind of like really trapped in it. But the big thing that we've run into is actually experiences of intimate partner violence and sexual abuse. That gets triggered in the rough and tumble play. And interestingly, it's first started to come up and be expressed through female students, but we've now had more male students have expressed it, particularly experiences of intimate partner violence. There's quite a few men who have been, hit by their female partners who didn't know how to handle it, didn't know what to do. And you put them in a playful situation with a woman. It's like, whoa, okay, now I gotta address this thing that I'm ashamed of, that nobody culturally supports me, nobody will even admit it's a real issue. And because you're a man, whatever, but it can be pretty traumatic when someone's extremely angry at you and expressing it violently.
Of course.
Even if you're less physically threatened by the altercation, it can still be deeply, deeply traumatic. And so that's been really beautiful. And yeah, it's
and they find they have a sort of I don't know what the word is, but they have a let's say a strong experience coming out of the other side of that.
Yeah. We find it incredibly healing. It's something that is spoken about, after our workshops all the time, is that people find their relationship to play, to sex dynamics, right? Like it's not intercourse or sexual. I don't like the term gender for a variety of reasons, but by sex, I'm referring to the sexes, male and female. There's dynamics between the sexes that a lot of us are deeply uncomfortable with, and that we don't really handle the fact that sexual attraction is a real thing, that coercion is a real thing, and all these things are potentially there in our interactions. And that sex aspect of reality is something that often I think we're really in denial about as a culture. We don't, and it gets exposed. It gets exposed when you're in a rough and tumble play experience. So one of the things that comes up a lot is, for like our female students, they find it incredibly encouraging and empowering to experience play with a man where they don't feel like there's a sexual element, and where they feel that man is willing to push them to their edges. It creates a kind of trust that is really, really rewarding for people. And the same
would you see that specifically, that particular dynamic being more so from the female experience in that boundary condition? Because obviously not all the time, but most of the time the male will have more physical strength. So they're ultimately the one that's going to be determining where the limitation is.
Yeah.
So would you see that particular dynamic playing more within the female experiencing play, a rough and tumble within the male?
Yeah. What is described very frequently from the students is that women students will say that this was really healing of their relationship towards men in some general way. And what interesting, they usually say that they feel like they're male, like they felt empowered because they were able to play with the man and it didn't hold back, which is it's not quite right from the male perspective because we are holding back, right? But it's more that we're willing to push them to their edges, right? So a lot of times what you'll see is that men who are not good at physical play, when they're with a woman, they'll either be way too forceful or not forceful at all. And so they're very hard they find it very hard to find the sort of zone of proximal development for that female partner.
Beautiful. Yes.
And when women experience a partner who can meet them in that zone of proximal development, who can be trustworthy and who can keep the experience non-sexual, they found that to be really, really healing and trust building, not just for the man that they're working with, but in some sense, it starts to heal a relationship that many women have towards masculinity or men in general, which is
amazing.
Really,
well, it's
really,
Beauty and the Beast, isn't it? It sounds like women civilizing men is like the classic story.
It is the classic story, yeah.
Really cool.
But it's interesting because if you think about it, there's a sort of layer there that's a little bit more nuanced because it's something like a woman discovering her own savageness. Her relationship to a man who's sufficiently civilized, but not too civilized. Which is it's kind of tasty to think about it.
All right, we're talking a lot about your work, which is great. Infinite time. Let's talk about my work. I'm curious what you've been what's touched you, what's moved you, what's been interesting to you. I've been doing this Substack. I've been doing that on a very regular basis, posting on Instagram a little bit, some of the physical practice stuff. I think that's kind of it from my public output. But what's been interesting to you?
Well, really all of it, just the basic thing of somebody who's doing deep research on a psychological, physiological understanding of human beings and connecting it to movement practices and connecting it to those movement practices in relationship to really a broader search for self-development, right? So, when you write about anxiety, you're writing about anxiety through the lens of the parkour practice, but informed by deep psychological research. But you're not talking about it as in a kind of highly localized way of like, if I'm preparing you to be a great parkour athlete, I want you to overcome your anxiety so that you can do these jumps. You're really talking about now parkour is a vehicle by which we study the experience of anxiety so that we can, I guess, experience a better life.
Yeah, yes and no. I step quite actively away from parkour in a lot of what I do. Whilst it's my physical foundation, my practice, I recognize the limitations of that as something accessible and available. So within the courses that I run, I tend to offer choice as much as possible. Mm-hmm. So within what I've run in this anxiety study, which has been a 12-week deep dive that we'll talk more about, I've offered 3 different approaches into the kind of physical development aspect. So one related to acrobatics, particularly hinging around this idea of letting go. So actually trying to find kind of other mechanisms of control that are not just tension. Mm-hmm. We can talk about this kind of reflex tension. Also offering work on collisions, so dealing with force, developing these physical boundaries, this technical management, but also just the raw tissue development of colliding the body into hard surfaces, at the right kind of volumes and intensities that can actually yield a stimulus. That's been really very powerful, I think, for some people. And then also some work with some of the reflexes, the postural reflexes, which has been, I think, quite interesting as well. Yeah, but just to say that it's not. I don't want to attach myself too strongly to parkour because it's something very specific, and I love parkour, and it's in a direct kind of workshop context for sure. I'll be including parkour elements but it's quite hard to direct from a kind of online perspective and all of these things. So I just try to cast the net a little bit wide, so people have the choice to work with what resonates with them. We were talking a little bit about this earlier in terms of actually getting people to participate in online work is very difficult. And so I've run a lot of these kinds of online things at this point, and it's like one of the most successful strategies I've found is giving choice.
Yeah,
is giving options for people to pursue based on what resonates with them, in that kind of physiological way. What gives them that sense of interest and curiosity aligns with needs and values.
Yeah. I mean, when we look at like practice design research from like an ecological dynamics perspective, we run into the idea of student autonomy as one of the main things that allows us to access student motivation, right?
Right.
That's one of the things I'm writing about from my work right now, is this idea of like, okay, we think so much at the physiological level or the technical level, but the ability of the student to acquire the skill is often like upstream at the psychological, emotional level, right?
Uh-huh.
When the student arrives, are they motivated? What are they motivated by? Do you as the teacher have the ability to connect with, comprehend, and attune to and bring forth the motivation that person has? And then do you have the ability to navigate through the emotional ups and downs of the journey towards that skill? And it's like, you could have an extraordinarily detailed progression schema for how to build a specific skill, but if the student's not motivated when they're doing it, it's not important. If they get super scared or super anxious or angry and frustrated, what is the tool set that you're applying to it? So student autonomy is actually a really great place to start finding motivation and avoiding some of these traps, as well as ultimately, what do you want students to be able to do with the stuff that you teach them? And if they're constantly dependent on you for direction, then then what have you?
And these are super deep questions, like how to. I love this word, sublimation, like to move to a higher level.
Yeah.
For example, like anxiety can be a great source of energy. These questions such as like, what am I afraid of in this moment?
Yeah.
What am I avoiding? What am I putting off? These kinds of things. Like if you're in a state where you can move in that direction, it's a great source of energy. And this kind of work, I think, is just so valuable. Developing that kind of crystalline structure in the center. The clear bead that changes everything, as Rumi said. From which to move from, in that sense of kind of alchemizing the energies that you have available to you to do the work that you can do in that moment. Work is, I think we were also saying earlier, it's just what do you do to keep the system alive? You're just putting energy into the system, That's work. Things fall apart, so you need to put energy, back into them. And I think there's a level of maturation required to see what energy you have available to you in a given moment that you can then go, okay, that's what I have available to me. I can put that back into the system. Okay, I'm really tired right now. I'm too tired to do some super creative work, realistically. Yeah. Okay, but I can clean my house. This kind of thing. I think this is the direction to go in.
That's it. Really interesting what you just shared there. Few different things, but first of all, I think we actually talked about work earlier, but that was literally what I was thinking about this morning as I was sitting there, because I've been, I'm working with my kids. So I have an 11 and 9 and a 6-year-old, right? And there's some, I'm struggling with the world that they live in, right? So my kids have been exposed to parkour and movement skills and martial arts since they were tiny, and they're physical freaks, right? Like my son at 9 years old can do 23 pull-ups and strict muscle ups, and he can do a one-arm walk-off on each arm, and he's got a 21-inch vertical leap and everything. His sisters are incredibly strong as well, and not quite at that level, but my 11-year-old daughter can do 5 or 6 pull-ups, and she just finished 3rd in the district for the 50-meter hurdles, it wasn't like not trained track athletes. This was like, they just took all the kids out in fifth grade and let them, and had a little track meet. But she did well despite not training track at all, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I'm running into is that it's really hard to fight against the culture, right? Like I want my kids outside playing with other kids, but all the other kids are inside on devices, which makes it harder, right? And I see, I don't know if you've been reading like Jonathan Haidt stuff on the anxious generation, but I see this anxiety building up in my kids, basically from the social isolation that's built into a culture where all of the kids are on devices all the time.
Yeah. And how does that manifest in your kids, may I ask, that anxiety? How do you see that behaviorally or internally?
Well, like yesterday, my daughter didn't have yoga pants to go to her dance class, and she had to wear shorts and a t-shirt, and she, had a crying fit before we took her to the dance class. And then she got poison oak, and so she's been like stuck at home with poison oak, and she was complaining to me like, okay, I just really wish I could go swimming. So finally, like, she's pretty much, she just has like markings from the poison oak. So I finally took her, convinced her to come out. It was a huge thing to finally convince her to come out. Like, you're fine now, like, come go swimming. But she doesn't want to swim because she's afraid that people will see that she has these little marks from the poison oak. And it's overwhelming for her. And then, my son's been struggling sometimes to go to bed because he'll start worrying about projects at school, which is, it's like he's like 3 grades up in reading and 2 grades up in math. It's like, he's fine. But, if he doesn't get exactly perfect, he's super anxious about it. So those are some of the experiences that I've been having. And I think a lot of it is actually that there's just not the kind of play available to them that was available to previous generations. Like, I can play with them, I can send them outside to play, but if there's not other kids, then play just doesn't gestate and open out the same way. And everyone is so afraid to let their kids outside, and kids are so distracted by devices that I can't just kick my kids out and they won't just find friends in the neighborhood, because the friends in the neighborhood are indoors and they're not allowed outside. The potential friends. And so it's a real, like, it's a behavioral ecology problem, right? The ecology that my children are growing in is fundamentally unhealthy in a really profound way that is invisible to most people. So that was quite the tangent from what we were talking about, right? But to tie it back, like the default thing that happens in this moment is that kids just sit and read books or sit and are on their screens. I never thought that I would have to fight my kids to not read too much.
Yeah, it can also be a defensive response for sure.
Yeah, they'll read. My son might be reading the same, silly graphic novel the 50th time, and doing that, instead of going outside and being physical. And so what I was thinking about this morning is just the idea that I need to articulate for them what healthy development looks like, and that they're in a situation where they have to actively do work to avoid things falling apart. And things are going to fall apart in specific ways in the environment they're in. If they don't actively work to have a life that involves movement outdoors, and actively work to have a life that involves socialization, it's not going to happen. It's not going to come find them. They have to be the change. right? And so we have this, we have, you know, the, uh, the, the inertia of our culture is towards Wall-E.
Sure.
And so you know, we cannot simply kick our kids outside and say, hey, go live like you did in the 1970s and 80s, because there's not enough people doing it.
You actually have to make them conscious of the problem. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
That's rough. It's rough for, for really young kids to bring them to that level of consciousness is a very strange thing in a historical sense, right? Like, because maybe these values would be implicit within the culture, and then you go outside and you play and you have this development. And I'm full of equal parts dread and admiration for the young people, because I think it's on one hand you have parents such as yourself who are having these difficult conversations. There's always a pain in becoming more conscious, of course, but having these conversations, and what is on the other side of that, I think is just shockingly new in a sense. Like it's not something that's really happened before with very young people having that level of awareness of the world. But then, as you're saying, on the other side of that, yeah, it is. We're in the Wallification of people, and it is really happening in exactly that way. Less and less connection to the physical world. So
this is interesting. Let's tie this back to your work, because we're trying to highlight what you do as well. So Wall-E, for anyone who's not familiar, is a Pixar film about a bunch of people. The Earth got too polluted, so people went out into space and they just ride around on couches, getting fed entertainment all the time and food, and so they're just blobs of fat sitting on couches. And of course, that is sort of more and more how a lot of people are experiencing reality, and it seems to be exactly what the tech companies want to have happen. They want to capture your attention as much of the time as possible, which means essentially removing all barriers to you directly looking at a screen every day. And then what we're seeing with that is that young people, it's so funny. Like, I talk to my daughter gets really upset with me because I basically am like, the 80s were better, right? She's tired of hearing back in my day.
Sure.
And then like my childhood was in a lot of ways not so great in comparison, right? Like, I got in lots of physical fights. I experienced various types of abuse as a child. We were, under the poverty line growing up. And so like, those are pretty obvious things, right? Like, my kids don't get hit. They always have enough food. They always have more than enough stuff, with way too much stuff. It's a weird problem. We're on the other side, right? Like, you have a river of stuff being sent by grandparents that we're trying to, like, how do we fit all their stuff in the house? How do we teach them to have, like, it's easy to clean when you have 6 toys. It's hard to clean when you have 600 toys. It's the chaos problem.
You're getting there.
Okay, so in many ways they're much more privileged than I was, right? But they're impoverished in ways that are hard to point at, which is impoverished in play, right? Like, I could walk out of the door in my house and go find my cousin or my brother or the kid next door. Like, there was always kids to play with, and we just played outside every day, right? My youngest daughter is now having this experience. We moved into this little cul-de-sac, and it just so happens that there's like 7 kids under 7 years old in this neighborhood, and they just go outside on the cul-de-sac and they play all day. And so she's having an experience like we had in the 80s, where when she gets home from school, she's like, Dad, I'm going to Leah's. She's gone, right? And it's beautiful, but it's becoming less and less common. And what we're seeing is that that's giving rise to the most depressed, the most anxious, the most confused, the most politically polarized generation of kids we've ever seen. This has been really well documented by John Haidt and
Okay,
Frey.
so we can let's be bold. Let's even try and make a bit of headway on this problem. I think your proposition is that the center of the issue is a lack of play.
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely see that. I would see that the center of the issue is a lack of sensitivity or a lack of awareness. For example, when you're on your phone and you've been scrolling for, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, and then you get off your phone, you realize that you were actually not having a nice time.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's very hard to notice when you're in that experience. You're actually not having a good time. You're actually not you're not experiencing pleasure. You're not even really experiencing excitement. It's just a very sort of like stable kind of blur, with this very contracted, musculature. So it's actually not a good time. If we were all able to ramp up our sensitivity by like 20 to 50%, I think we would quite quickly realize that the things we thought were pleasurable or enjoyable are often not that at all. And then we might start seeking, these sorts of things. There are many things that contribute, I think, to that lack of sensitivity. For example, a lack of play. Of course, being in a city, having less reason to be sensitive. I think when you're out in the countryside, there's just a little bit more less, So there's it's a lot easier to notice change. That's sort of what sensitivity is, the ability to notice change. And so when the environment is sort of stable, very stable, but then like subtly changing, through the seasons, and this change that comes in a more natural environment, there is a natural sensitivity. There's a natural noticing the change that comes. But when you're in the city, it's like the environment is more or less exactly the same. Sometimes it's colder, sometimes it's warmer, to set, but you don't really get that organic growth, that organic change. So there's less reason to pay attention when you're in the city. So yeah, I would see that as being a big factor within a lot of this, the wallification. And then of course, if you're in that pod, you're in the Wally pod and you're jacked up to the screen and all of this stuff. If you don't know anything different to that, then it's more difficult to step back from it. And it's also a problem.
So two, I really enjoyed that. But two things that popped up in my mind in response to that. One is this idea that not only is sensitivity maybe encouraged by a more natural rural environment, but that desensitization and the kind of dehumanization is actually adaptive to the stressors that the environment creates. Simply the noise environment. That's right. It's you can't be sensitive when the noise is too high, right? Like how sensitive are you to like just somebody's vocal signals in an extremely loud room, right? So if you turn up and like a bunch of different stressors to 11, of course people are going to be desensitized, and they're going to choose things that desensitize them. Why do we default to our devices? Part of it is to remove us from experiences that we're having all the time that are extremely stressful. Being surrounded by strangers, being surrounded by loud noises, being surrounded by terrible smells, right? So I've been thinking a lot about the idea of, I think in some sense we have this fundamental onto-epistemological problem in our culture, which is the assumption that the right way to think about a human being is a computer walking around in a machine. That we can use these machines as metaphors for ourselves, and we become trapped in those metaphors and do not recognize how much is missed when we do so. And we see this, this is something that comes up all the time in physical training, right? Like we treat people as machines that we're installing programs into.
Mhm.
And then we miss all of the stuff we've been mentioning, right? But I have this idea that that the machine mind is actually, in some sense, an adaptive cutting off of
Mhm.
sensitivities that make urban life intolerable.
Mhm. I have some friends in London, part of the kind of London parkour street rap community.
Yeah.
One friend in particular, Tom Mackey, who he works as a scaffolder and sometimes cycles all the way across London, so like an hour and a half cycle to get to work on what I think is a dilapidated Lime bike, like one of the old, kind of like Barclays bikes, Boris bikes that you can rent. One of these that's just fallen out of commission. So he would cycle maybe an hour and a half across London, work, uh, obviously very hard physical work for however many hours, cycle back, and then he would train, and then he would practice, and he's always uploading on his stories, and uh, he'll eat a pack of few packs of sardines, and like eating inexpensive, as like nutritious as possible, um and he's training a lot, and I think he's very happy, strangely enough. So what I think is also really important, and I think one of the really beautiful things about training as a process of physical progression, to differentiate physical and psychological progression, maybe we can talk about that, but physical progression is that sense of possibility, the possibility of moving forwards. And that, I think, that sense of kind of enchantment, that sense of curiosity about the environment, that sense of you look at the world and you see it as something dynamic to take part in, or to shape, to actively shape. I think this is again a great source of energy, because then you look at the world with opportunity rather than as this real like prison like structure. So yeah, in that sense, I think finding joy in training, finding training goals that are innately joyful to move towards, but I think engaging in that specific process of physical progression, getting stronger, whatever the goal is for you, finding something, and again, then we can talk about how do you choose such a goal, and this is also a really important question. Maybe we can talk about that, but yeah, I think just that sense of, I mean, it's kind of a chicken and egg question. Is like, do you find a sense of meaning, and then from that sense of meaning you gain a sense of vitality, or do you start with a sense of vitality and then from that you naturally pursue kind of meaningful things? And I think it can work in both directions. And it's something that I was kind of hoping that we would talk a bit about today. I didn't get to read it, but I just saw that you posted somewhere about the like the Jordan Peterson advice that nearly ruined your life, something like this. So this is something that's also very interesting to me, and joy is a topic that I've been studying very closely for the last year or 2 years. And one of the people kind of central to this study, who's also very very similar to Peterson in a lot of the work, and a lot of similarities within looking at anxiety, looking at the relationship to the boundaries of belief and orientation in these kinds of things. But I think Peterson says you get your sense of meaning by finding the heaviest thing that you can carry, and carry it as far as you can until you collapse. And Kierkegaard is more like saying, when you find the thing that is the most kind of meaningful burden that you can carry, even though the act of carrying is not as light as a dance, your faith that you will that you're moving with this sense of purpose is a source of joy.
Yeah.
So this presence of joy in Kierkegaard's work, who I think Peterson is allegedly basing It's a dog. Hello. That Peterson is referencing a lot, and I think basing a lot of his, at least his questions on. Peterson really misses the presence of joy in his work, and I think you see that a lot in his presence. There's a lack of levity there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is a really, really important also point in this conversation, is that I think once you have the right boundaries, once you have the right orientation, it's a lot easier to find a sense of joy, and that I think that can also fuel all of these things. It can fuel the experience of vitality and meaning. But what seems really important there is having the right boundaries, having the right questions or the right orientation to pursue.
Yeah. My mind wants to go in a lot of directions there.
It's and I just quickly I want to say, like, it's really difficult to talk about these things because there's part of me that, like, so we've gone very much into this like predictive processing work, like we've gone very, very deep into this world, and it's like what we're talking about we can also talk about in terms of free energy and upper bounds and things like this, but this is not the right language, I think, for most conversations, right? Because it's really boring, but
we'll get there. Before we started recording, I was mentioning my mentor and good friend John Vervaeke. It sounds like you haven't dove into his work yet, but I would highly recommend it. He's actually doing academic work with on the integration of predictive processing and his model called relevance realization, that I think you would find very interesting. But I want to go in a different direction. There's a beautiful song by Jacob Banks. Have you ever heard of the soul artist Jacob Banks?
No.
It's called Slow Up. And it's a song to his son, basically saying, like, don't be in a hurry to grow up. And he says, what I've learned from the ocean, it's hard to dance and enjoy and rejoice in motion. Let the sun have its moment, the moon will come. What I've learned from a soldier, every man is a son to a daughter, and we only remember when we see the blood. So don't grow up on me. Keep that backstroke in your afro. Don't grow up on me. Slow up home. Don't grow up on me. Keep it OG, sipping slowly. What I've learned from a traveler is no road that can lead to nirvana. There's a world to discover, but home is love. So you can go on, but the reason that came up for me was this tension that I think between the positive emotion that comes from forward movement and the positive emotion that comes from embeddedness in the moment, and how we're sort of stuck between those. And I think that what you see in Peterson is that he is a great prophet of the power of having a goal to move to. His whole model of maps of meaning starts with, you are always in the unbearable present, moving towards the ideal future. It's like, well, but then that just means life's unbearable, right? You have to be able to switch between us. And this is something I've experienced in my practice, right? Like there's always some goal on the horizon that motivates your practice. But if you get hyper focused on that goal, then you don't experience the joy of moving towards it, of playing in it, or of just being there, right? So I always get a little bit, I think that in that machine mind, we have this tendency to want to like turn everything into chemicals, right? But you could say, you have a dopaminergic sort of source of pleasure, which is that thing that tells you you're moving towards a goal, which can be very powerful and motivating. And then you have more of a serotonergic, like, you're here. It's good right now. Oh, maybe oxytocin, maybe other things. And so we need to be able to move between those. And one of the interesting things that you were actually mentioning, you had a really good article about sex and anxiety recently, and about how sex can be really damaged by being too goal oriented. Right? If we want what the positive aspects of sex to sort of arise, it's more of an opening space for it than it is an active pursuit of it.
Yeah, I would say when the goal becomes behavioral more than sensorial, I think that's when these natural reflexive processes are going to be more forthcoming. When you're pursuing pleasure, that's when the body is responding in this reflexive way that supports physiological arousal. But when we're, as many of us have experienced, perhaps a little self-conscious in these moments, then our goal, so to speak, becomes the presentation of ourselves in a particular way, which is not a pleasurable experience.
Yeah,
And
I think
this has an inhibitory effect.
that's profoundly true. I think it goes beyond that. I think that the pursuit of pleasure itself can, like pursuing pleasure itself can erode pleasure, because you're in reaching for a higher state of pleasure, you're then potentially creating insecurity about where you're at relative to state. So if you've had an active sexual life for a while, you know that sometimes when you have sex, it's extraordinarily ecstatic. Sometimes it's less ecstatic. And it also has different flavors, right? Sometimes you might have a very genital focused experience, and then sometimes you might have a very like generalized body experience, right? Or maybe a spiritual or emotional experience. If you are really actively seeking one thing in it, it's very easy to lose sight of the potential for other things. I watched a video recently about like the top 3 things a man can do to make sex pleasurable for a woman. And one of them was stop trying to get her an orgasm, which was kind of an interesting thing. It's like it can be a lot of pressure, a lot of self-consciousness, right? So like, take time, make it really focused on loving and pleasure, but like let what happens happen. And I think that's actually, there's a sort of naive, narcissistic way in which a man cannot worry about a woman's orgasm, and then there's like a higher, it's like a pre-trans fallacy, right? You've transitioned past that, and you can allow it to unfold. So the idea I'm pointing towards is this idea of, to what degree are you capable of being sensitive to allowing the unfolding of a process rather than trying to direct its flow, right? So in my experience with my wife recently, there has been a lot of stuff getting processed, right? I was sexually abused as a child, and it was something that I really suppressed, and it caused a lot of, turns out a lot of stuff. But I had IBS and irritable bowel syndrome and chronic fatigue for many years. So in the search to fix all this stuff, I finally kind of unlocked that trauma and was able to actually witness it and experience it. So I went on that. I did some internal family systems therapy for 6 weeks, and I did once a week. So I was doing it actually 6 days a week of internal family systems therapy, and once a week of somatic therapy. And at the end of that 6 weeks, I did a MDMA therapy session. And essentially my body shook violently for 4 hours, and screamed and cursed as I kind of released all of the stored emotions, all of the shame, disgust, and anger, and desire to run away and push away and attack that were sort of suppressed in me to survive the experiences that I had. So now, it's quite personal and explicit here, but when I make love to my wife, sometimes stuff comes up, right? Like all those suppressed memories, all that stuff now will arrive in the moment. And her ability and my ability to allow that to unfold without being anxious about it, then allows the arousal state, the connected state, the other stuff to reoccur on its own timeline. But if and I did for many years, if I sort of say, that's not what I'm here for. I have to be about this part of this experience of intimacy.
Yeah.
Then it actually inhibits the process and it makes me self-conscious in the process.
I think, I mean, the classic comparison is the thief of joy. I think it can also be said that judgment is interrupts presence.
Yes.
Whatever.
Oh. Yes. Okay. I've been rereading The Inner Game of Tennis recently. And I was reading some of your stuff around anxiety. It's very much reminds me of tennis. And without judgment, it's hard to generate clear boundaries and forward goals. But excessive judgment or poorly balanced judgment, that's this is the balance that we're playing with, I think. And this is why I place so much of an emphasis on play, because I think it's in play that we sensitize ourselves to these dynamics, where we can unlock an inherent educational process within us. Right?
Learning directly from the environment.
Yeah, it's yes, and from ourselves,
from the others. Yeah,
been thinking a lot about the idea of engineering versus gardening, right? As a metaphor for a process, right? So, if you're engineering or you're building something, you take the raw materials, you design what you want to have happen, and you basically carve everything into what you want. But you cannot force a rose to grow. You have to have faith in the rose's inherent process, and then you do create boundary conditions, right? You make sure that there's enough nutrients in the soil. You make sure that it's going to get enough sun exposure. You make sure that it's going to get enough water, right? So I think a lot of times when we are working with a human being, we think we're engaged in a process like building a car. And what we're actually trying to do is grow a rose or any kind of growth process.
Maybe one limitation of the analogy is, I think within psychological growth, you're really not trying to add anything. Within the gardening analogy, you're planting a bulb and then you're nurturing the bulb and that grows into a flower. That's my understanding of gardening, at least.
Yeah. I think,
I'll finish my perspective here is that at least within a lot of psychological growth, it's purely a process of nurturing what is present instead of introducing something new. And I think this distinction is very important, because we're a lot of the time we're thinking about we need to change. Or I need to change. I need to do something different. I need, maybe I need to introduce something new. I need to new diet, new training protocol, this sort of thing. But I think if we look at this process of psychological development, fundamentally, maybe there are things to add, but fundamentally about allowing what is already there to come out. Let's say the bulb is, it's been dormant since we were born, this kind of thing. In many ways, this analogy plays out of the nurturing the thing that's already there, and then that growing forth. For example, the way that sexuality or sexual arousal works with these reflex physiological processes as does a lot of our movement. It's like, well, we can work on developing these skills. Let's think of it in like a motor learning context, in a movement context. Okay, we can look at introducing these new skills, and then we can grow through this process. But to me, maybe that feels like gardening in the sense of adding the rosebud.
Yeah.
But I think gardening in the sense of maybe nurturing the soil that's already there. I'm trying to figure out the right metaphor as we're talking, but in the sense of nurturing what's already there. I think attuning to the right these natural processes and the physical and psychological states that support these natural processes. I really think this is where a lot of, maybe not the primary orientation for everyone, but I think there's a lot of juice to gain from getting the body in the right state. And I'm not talking about strength. I'm talking more about relaxation.
Yeah.
Reflexes are stimulus dependent. So if your reflexes to work, you have to respond directly to a stimulus in the environment. For example, like sexual arousal and pleasure. Okay, well, if you're not experiencing pleasure, then how are you going to really experience full sexual arousal? For example, and then also the psychological states, or the internal subjective psychological states that will also support these kinds of reflex functions from working is also being without this constant kind of self-judgment, self-consciousness, self-narrative. These things are also very, very inhibitory of the reflexes, perhaps because they amplify sensory information that is not really there. So if the reflexes respond directly to stimuli from the environment, and when we're often our own thoughts, we're amplifying information that is not present. Have you ever seen The Peep Show?
No.
With David Mitchell and I forget the other guy's name. These guys. So it's
on the web show. I quite enjoy those two comedians together.
If you like that kind of British kind of painful humor, which I think you might, then I can highly recommend The Peep Show. But there's a moment where one of them goes into this ecstatic dance practice, and it's all there, and it's their POV internal narrative is what you hear and what you see. And so there's a moment where he's trying to impress the girl, and he's in this like very, very constant speaking to himself all the time and this kind of thing, and he's just talking about how he's just moving in this kind of random way, and how he's not feeling a fucking thing, and this kind of thing. You see it in the way that he's moving, and everyone kind of responds to him in this particular way. So that there's this the physical, like muscular and mental, like attentional states that support like optimal and adaptive movement, I think are such a foundation that it is overlooked in my own practice, hugely overlooked as a more analytic person. Basically, I mean, probably anyone listening to this is also probably on that side of the spectrum of being a bit more high in intellect or analytic, probably. And you're probably also maybe going to resonate with this idea that the type of attention you pay to the world changes the type of world that you can interact with. So if you're constantly in your head, if you're constantly narrativizing, which is equivalent to judging, really, as you're forming these more kind of static conclusions, and then referencing these rather than referencing the direct sensory experiences. To give a very basic nugget, it's been really interesting in the anxiety study is with some people, the practice of focusing externally has been like life-changing. In a sense, not only in a parkour practice or in a movement practice, but in a social context. It's like I'm not going to focus on myself. I'm going to focus on what I want to do or what I want to express, and then what comes from that tends to be a lot more fluid. And it's sort of the paradox that when we focus externally, we actually bring more of ourselves than when we're self-conscious. So when we stop reflecting all the time, when we stop sort of doubling ourselves, reflecting on ourselves, we can actually move in this more sort of wholehearted way. For example, right now when I'm speaking, I don't have the self view on.
Nice.
Because I would be much more inhibited if I'm looking at myself, I'm checking my hair and this kind of stuff. It's like I'm going to be much more inhibited, much less relaxed than I am now. And this is the other real cornerstone of kind of what I'm alluding to, is relaxation is in really, really a powerful thing. Getting into a relaxed physical state.
Yeah.
In the same way that reducing the noise is going to, in a crowded space, is going to allow you to hear a particular conversation. That's a hard and fast law of psychophysics, or the Weber-Fechner law of just noticeable difference. So that's a power law. That's something that's happening all the time. Is the more intensity there is, the less sensitivity you have. There are some nuances there, but in a muscular level, if I'm very, very tense, or if I'm very, very conscious, my ability to interact with more kind of subtle stimuli is going to be impeded. So the workshops that I'm going to be holding in Germany in September, titled Animal Grace, because we're looking at these kinds of ideas. It's like, why do all wild animals move with this efficiency? And so we can look at some of the reflexes in the sense of the specific movements. So we're looking at things like the thrust extensor reflex, and these movements that are kind of fast and powerful and easy to learn. It's kind of what reflex movements sort of are. It's like they're already there. We just have to kind of refine them and apply them. But then we're also looking at the states of attention, the states of the body, and all of these things. So that's what I'm going to be sharing in Germany in September, which I'm
Where in Germany
looking forward to. Say again?
Where in Germany are you going?
The plans so far: Berlin, Hamburg, and then possibly Potsdam. We're looking at.
Oh, cool. Like so. There's a kind of a lot to try and integrate there.
Yeah.
So I think what I really heard was this call to the idea that what allows us to ultimately adapt responsibly and optimally is sensitivity, right? And that this is quite a challenge, and that in some sense what I'm thinking is that there's it's paradoxical, right? It's effort without effort, because you want to make change, you want to be moving towards things, you need to make judgments, and at the same time, those very things can undercut the things that allow you to do the thing. So it's not. I haven't found in my own practice that sort of being directionless is ultimately satisfying. I have to have directions to be oriented towards. But at the same time, there's this necessity for leaving space and having faith in the unfolding. I think you and I share a similar story where we were, there was an athletic aspect of us that was driven towards athletics. And then there was this very internalizing, very mental, very cognitive aspect. And in my experience, I got in my own way a lot in the beginning of my practice, and I felt very clumsy. And I attributed that to a lack of physical talent. And therefore, I doubled down on my mentation as a way to try to utilize my strength to make up for what I perceived as my weakness, right? Okay, the guys around me are naturally more athletic than me, but I am smarter than they are. So I will figure out a way to overcome. I'll just train better than everybody else, and that'll make up for it. And in retrospect, I think I was born and developed with a pretty powerful body, a body that had a lot of potential, right? Like, my father was a collegiate football player and all-state wrestler. My son is by far the most athletic kid in his school. So it's like the genetics seem to be pretty good. My brother was a very successful athlete as well. And I think like there was a couple things going on with me. I was carrying an immense amount of tension in my body that was directly inhibiting my reflexive ease of movement and making me clumsy, right? I sprained my ankles over and over again. Turns out that one of the muscle groups that tends to become hypertonic in response to complex PTSD is your ankles. So there's a certain clumsiness in me which came from basically like unprocessed trauma. But theorizing more in the act of practice or trying to be more internally controlled actually directly inhibited my ability to simply get better through trusting the process, right? I've been in that place where I'm way too self-conscious and way too consciously controlled and way too goal-directed to the point where I'm literally killing myself to try to achieve things. And then I've gone to a place where I'm completely joy-oriented, right? I just do what I enjoy. And I found that on the other side of just being joy-oriented, my experience was that I started to lose some of my action capabilities. I didn't have a structure to stay strong, stay capable. The things that I enjoyed doing were now not as easily in my capacity, so it was easier for me to hurt myself. So I had to find a kind of orientation that allowed me to continue to put work. Right? There is that simple thing, like you have to let the rose unfold, but you still got to go out and water the garden every day. And so I've thought about these two concepts that I get from John Vervaeke, which are old Greek words that imply two different aspects of self-control: enkratia and sophrosine. So enkratia is self-control that involves the exertion of will, right? If you see a chocolate cake and you know it's not part of your diet, but you're deeply tempted, but you have to push it away. That's enkrasia. Now, if you've absorbed a certain way of being, a certain sensitivity to yourself that you know that ultimately, even though the chocolate cake could be enjoyable, it just doesn't have any hold on your psyche, that's self-esteem. It's not that you ignore the chocolate cake or that you're not interested in. And so the way that I tend to think about it is that we want to use the exertion of will, or the enkratia approach to self-control, only as a way to open the capacity to have a self-esteem experience, right? So it's like you exert will to begin to create a practice, but what you want is that if you set the practice up right, it becomes self-reinforcing. It invites you in. You're tempted always by your practice. You know how good you're going to feel if you do your practice. So you just do your practice, right? You don't have to be like, I gotta drag myself out of bed to do this. So I think that for some reason that comes up as a way to start to solve these problems. Like, okay, yeah, how do I set up the ecology of my life such that it becomes more and more self-reinforcing? And there's always work to do, right? Like if you can create a permaculture farm where there's all these self-reinforcing systems, but things are always going to break down. You're always going to have to go back to them.
Yeah, I think again that thing of sensitivity comes through. I think that one of the interesting things that I think happens with increased sensitivity is that the kinds of sensory experiences you respond to are more homeostatic, more in the context of self-regulation. So, for example, maybe it's easier to tell if you're thirsty as you move away from this heavy self-narrativizing kind of constant background noise of let's call it thought.
Mhm.
I think as you reduce the presence of this, maybe you reduce the internal monologue. There's this conversation now about how some people have this very strong internal monologue,
Yeah.
and then some people don't have it really at all. My wife has very little internal monologue, but she's perfectly good at self-regulating and all of these things. You often see people who have a very strong internal monologue maybe struggling with some of these more basic kind of homeostatic behaviors. So I think it can be a very, very healthy thing to, by developing these kinds of presence, this kind of presence work, finding a way to get a bit more connection to that sense of, I need a glass of water right now. These very, very simple things. And I think the upper limit of that, what that might look like is also not maybe what you're looking for consciously. Because if I'm in a very sensitive place, I might recognize how much I need to rest. And maybe that resonates.
Yeah. Well, I had doing all this somatic work and everything, like it's quite exhausting. And then I've had to just basically take a nap almost every day, right?
Yeah.
I've been just having to learn to really respect, and there's I take a lot of pride and have a lot of desire. Well, I guess there's a lot of complex emotions for me around the work that I do, right? Like it's very meaningful to me to be really good at parkour or martial arts and movement. And it's very meaningful for me to be actively pursuing deep theoretical knowledge and deep practical knowledge that I can share with the world. And I have a sense for myself of how creative I can be. That when I'm operating at my peak, I generate new perspectives, new ideas, and I pioneer things on the edge of things a lot. Like I've done that a tremendous amount. And there's lulls and there's doldrums. There's times when I'm not as creative. There's times when I'm not as driven, right? Like I haven't had nearly the same drive to read lots of scientific literature.
Mm-hmm.
I'm envious of you when I read your Substacks. God, I know the type of thing that he's doing. I've done lots of it, and right now I don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's been a profound need to accept that it's not that I am lazy. It's not that I am incapable of doing this kind of work. It's that there's another process that's happening right now that's demanding my resources. And that I've been thinking a lot about this idea of having faith that if I give myself the right resources, I will continue on to unfold in the ways that I have historically unfolded, right? It's like, I don't have to force myself to be me. I can try to take care of myself such that I can be me. That's it's still an ongoing challenge.
One of the insights that came very strongly through the joy study that I did last year is that if you're not able to generate, give yourself resources purely for your own sake, nurture your physiological, psychological, boundaries, aka a bit of self-love.
Mm-hmm.
And that as a foundation, I think it bleeds into so much else.
Yeah.
And for me, again, it's like we're really living in a very, very, very strange, very stressful, very difficult, very tragic time. And I think people are not resting. It's just it's clearly one of the kindest things that you can do for yourself. It's clearly one of the most beneficial things that you can do for yourself. Is just regularly taking these, 10, 20 minute deep rest sessions, whether it's like a guided, like non-sleep deep rest, or, just something that is, it's not work. It's not like you're not adding energy into the system necessarily. It's just maybe just relaxing, letting go of that. Relax means let go. The etymology, right?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, the analogy that pops in my mind is like if you're working, right? If you're exerting effort, that your ability to exert effort along any dimension is going to decrease over some period of time if you continue the same task. Mm-hmm. And that rest resets your capacity. So if we want to have an optimal strength training session, sometimes we need to rest much more than is comfortable. When I started training sprinting, I worked with an elite sprint coach. His daughter was, his name's Mike Cunliffe. His daughter, Hannah, was a 6-time national champion. And I think multiple time national record holder in the age group sprinting. She hasn't quite done as well at the elite level, but she's a very elite sprinter, like a 11-second female sprinter in the 100. And he had worked with a bunch of elite high school athletes going into college ranks. So I went to train with him, and I was just shocked how much of his practices were not practicing. Like, and he didn't do anything during the not practicing parts. Like, he would be on his phone, he was chilling.
Yeah.
He was, like, the kids are just hanging out. But his general rule was that for every 10 yards that you sprint in a given sprinting effort, you need to rest for 1 minute. So if we did 180s, right, 180 meter sprints, right, you'd only do 15-minute rest for 180s. But so you might do 3 sprints in a session. So you do your warm up, you'd sprint 3 times, and then you'd spend 45 minutes of the practice just hanging out. And then you do your plyometrics, and then you go home, right? And that was it. That was the practice. That was a typical practice. And he didn't care at all what the kids did, basically, in between their sprint efforts. The kids just hung out. It was just hanging out. And he produced these incredibly fast athletes. It's just rest.
Yeah. Naturally, we have some, cool, deep relaxation practices that I think can be quite interesting. But I think it's also very realistic and sustainable to just hang out. I think it's also very, very healthy.
If you're working with a bunch of 15-year-old kids, like, let them just be kids.
No, for sure. Definitely.
So, just the same thing, I think we often sort of feel like we have to keep grinding on work projects when it's like, oh yeah, like you reached the end of that set, or the end of that rep. No, you need to rest before you take it on again. And I think that's very hard in our culture, in our Protestant work ethic culture, to recognize the necessity for those cycles. Yeah. Even have the day night sleep, but no, less and less, right?
It even feels like there's an association between tension and work. For one, that when I'm working, I'll always be in a state of tension. Mm-hmm. And perhaps that when I'm in a state of tension, therefore I'm working. And I think that leads us to being very, very tense on a base level.
Yeah.
Because we associate the feeling of tension with the feeling of busyness, of work. Mm-hmm. And maybe something there is important, really, to clearly define what is work. We've kind of alluded to this, like things fall apart naturally, and then we have to put energy to make them, fall together. That's what work is. It's like we're putting energy into a system so that it grows, or at least doesn't fall apart. And I think that definition is not compatible with tension itself. So just tension for the sake of tension. So, for example, there was a really cute photo of a panda in a zoo who had learnt to break sticks. It was an orphan panda.
Yeah.
Very sad. But had learned to break sticks, watching other humans who do, they tense their SCM and all of this stuff. And so there's a photo of a panda sitting there with this very uncharacteristic for an animal, no longer graceful, breaking the stick in this very, very tense way. So it's something that we learn from each other, is also to produce a lot of tension. And I think it's something that we can it's potentially a real revolution to learn to do things with less tension. Because again, as we've been alluding to, this idea of tension sensitivity. When we have less tension, we have more sensitivity a lot of the time. So there's a curve of improvement that's accessible from a state of low tension that is simply not accessible from a state of high tension.
Mm-hmm.
So, people with more refined movement tend to become more refined over time, and people with less refined movement tend to, continue in that trajectory. So, don't be like the panda.
Yeah, I think there's a cultural script element of that, or maybe a cultural ecology as well, which is that we admire effort, right? Right. Like, we love Rocky. We want to see the guy who's not that talented, who just grinds and grinds and grinds. Sure. Or like Kobe Bryant. That's the other article I wrote about this. Like Kobe Bryant, is up at 3:30 a.m. to get his weight training in, to get his shots up before he goes to the gym, etc. So I think a lot of times people would rather say, at least I worked my hardest than, oh, I actually won. And I won it because it was easy. Right? There's more satisfaction. Our cultural script is more about the value of hard work and Protestant work ethic. And you said work earlier, and I wanted to just offer maybe a refinement of the definition you offered, which is just that it's the application of energy to a specific process. Right? And what's interesting about a physical practice is that it makes it clear how, if we really pay attention to it, how much the effective application of energy comes through cycles of tension and relaxation, right? You cannot punch very powerfully if your muscles cannot relax. And then the use of passive or reciprocal or responsive things, right? So your muscle tenses, but it tenses to create tension through connective tissue, and then the connective tissue can be used and sort of rhythmically using ground reaction forces, etc., to give us far less effort to achieve a much more powerful result. So it's an interesting analogy to think, how could we build our lives like that in general? That we fully recognize the power that our relaxation offers in manifesting the capacity or energy towards a specific process that we're trying to use tension to achieve. Mm-hmm. And how much that then can be connected to reflexive processes, right? Yeah. How we build those so that, you could kind of think you literally, like, people are actually built like this, right? Some people are really fast because they have very strong and extremely explosive muscles. And some people don't have nearly as strong or explosive muscles and are equally fast because they have extremely sensitized and strong, resilient passive tissues. And the way you train those athletes is actually quite distinct, right? Athletes who are naturally very elastic tend to respond to longer efforts. This is something a friend of mine, Joel Smith, talks about. When you get they tend to be slender, kind of guys, without a lot of muscle mass. And what he's found is that like he likes to do things like 200 meters of skipping with this profile of athlete, and that the connective tissue just gets stronger and stronger. And then it offers this strength to the athlete without having a lot of metabolic cost. Right? So sustain it over a longer effort. Whereas an athlete who has maybe a naturally bigger muscular structure, shorter limbs, doesn't have those super long tendon lengths, tends to respond to really high effort, long relaxation tendencies. But you can imagine maybe we can build ourselves this way in some sense in our life. Like, how can we build a life such that we can actually sustain the application of energy to processes with less internal tension? Analogy that's occurring.
I think, yeah, on one hand, there is the regular practice, the daily practice of taking this 10 to 20 minute period, which some people, again, in the anxiety study have been finding very, very beneficial to apply. And I think there's also a moment to moment questioning, which I think it starts again, as all things do, as a more conscious checking, but it can become something that you can assume is there. It's just checking baseline level of tension. Lower abdomen is a great space as a sort of index for everything else. Flow of breath, the exhale, and the softening, the flattening of the chest, these kinds of things. Some of these small things can be upstream of a lot of other kinds of tension. So, regularly noticing these things, letting go, relaxing. Whilst I'm doing the dishes, how am I standing? Am I standing in a way that my shoulders are up by my ears? My jaw is, locked into place. Scrubbing as if I'm, waiting to meet the queen, this kind of thing. It's like, or it's not even necessarily about speed as well, but I think it's just a great cue that we came across in the anxiety study recently was just do it as if it's not important.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff about that around choking in sports. That the more importance, in some sense, you place on the outcome, the more likely your performance will degrade. So, like Nikola Jokic is maybe the best player in the NBA right now, and he seems to care much less about the NBA than he cares about his horses back home in Serbia. And it's like that. He's incredibly clutch. He just doesn't care. He's just playing. So effortless. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing. One thing I've noticed to myself as I've been like really studying my body tension is like when I'm driving, I'll often put my hand underneath my leg in such a way it's actually pressing on the joints uncomfortably, and my hand has to be tense, and it's just an automatic tension expression. Or I'll be gripping a lot, right? And I'll be holding on to something with way more tension than I need. Well, one of the interesting things I got from the game of tennis is like I really struggled to develop my parkour climate for many years. I had a lot of elbow pain when I started training. And he has that bit about, rather than asking for anything from something, just shift your attention around and ask what's happening as you practice a skill. So I was like, on these reps of my climb up, I'm going to pay attention to my grip. Right? I'm not going to ask for anything from my grip. I'm just going to feel what's happening with my grip. And what I discovered was that I was so concerned about making sure that I was gripping strong enough. I was radiating a ton of tension into my forearm and upper arm, which was actually making it really hard for me to produce a really strong acceleration out of the bottom, right? Like this tension was making me slow, which was making me climb up not very powerful. So I had to teach myself to to actually grip less on a climb up to climb up faster.
Attention is a very strange and mysterious thing in that sense of how it can unveil what's already there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have to go. I have another call here in a little bit. Some time to relax between.
Sounds good.
But you do have in 2 weeks. So we'll get this out next week. It'll go out next Thursday. So I guess there'll be maybe 1 week before you start your next project.
Great. Yeah, 29th of June, start the confidence practice.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell people just a little bit about that and why they might be interested in it? Yeah. So you've already told us that you're touring. Your Substack is just movement and psychology.
Yeah, movement and psychology, or Flynn Disney. It's you can try and Google it. Maybe you'll find.
And on Instagram, Flynn Disney.
That's right.
Those are the only platforms you're using right now: Substack and Instagram.
Yeah.
And so then you're touring Germany. People can find that through the Substack.
Yeah, that's right. Or we haven't announced it yet, but it'll be on the Substack. It'll be on the gram. Okay. Confidence practice is short training sessions that are supplementary to your main practice, designed with a lot of what we've been talking about in mind. We have some relaxation practices in there. We have some games that are working with states of attention. We have games working with reflexes and good attractors. And then we have dynamics and collisions, which is basically going hard and fast through ranges of motion that are very commonly used, such as jumping, kicking, swinging the arms, moving the spine. It's just about getting this strong sense of feed forward, like pushing a movement straight into the world, which is really associated with confident movement. So super cool. It's very science based, but I think it's just very digestible, user friendly, and I'm all about the user experience. So I'll be there very much active within the experience 3-month period. After this, I'll also sell it as an online standalone thing. But for now, it's going to be this 3-month course. And Animal Grace in September. We're going to be looking at a lot of this material, developing reflexive movement, thoughtless, efficient, graceful movement. Yeah, for dancers, athletes, parkour, acrobatics. It's very general. So very general stuff.
With your course, are you going to be like meeting with the students as a group in addition, or are you going to be sending out assignments as videos, as like text, or is it being done through meetings? What's the delivery format?
So the mediums will be Zoom for 1 weekly training session altogether, which is just so helpful to have that direct feedback of like, no, you're not doing that right. Let me correct it. Okay, now keep going. And then you'll also get a PDF with a little bit of theory, but mostly just links to the practical work, templates, things like this. And then there'll also be a Slack page, which is just a nice place to communicate, share some training sessions, share some memes,
Okay, sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Flynn. I really wish you luck. I think it sounds like a really great thing that you're putting together. And also the joy study that you mentioned earlier and the anxiety study. I don't know if you're doing those again or if they're available in any format, but I think those also look really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And, I wish you luck with continued development and, life with the baby.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.